Rachel had always struggled to find stability in life. At just 24 years old, she was already a single mother, raising her 4-year-old daughter, Ava, in a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of town. Money was always tight, and the stress of working long hours at a local diner left her exhausted. Ava was the only bright spot in her life, a sweet and curious little girl with big brown eyes and a love for bedtime stories. Despite the challenges, Rachel did her best to give her daughter a good life. When Rachel met Jason, everything changed. He was only 16, still in high school, but something about him drew her in. Maybe it was the way he paid attention to her, the way he made her feel wanted. Jason was different from the men she had dated before. He was bold, confident, and had a rebellious streak that excited her. He made her laugh, made her feel young, again. When he told her he loved her, she believed him. Their relationship moved quickly. Jason started spending more time at Rachel's apartment, skipping school to be with her. He wasn't interested in finding a job, but Rachel didn't mind. She liked having him around. He made her feel safe, like she wasn't alone in the world. But not everyone saw Jason the way she did. Friends and co-workers raised their eyebrows when she mentioned his age. Some even warned her, saying he was too young, too troubled. Rachel brushed off their concerns. No one understood their connection. Ava, however, was not as taken with Jason as her mother was. She was quiet around him, hesitant. She flinched when he raised his voice and clung to Rachel whenever he was near. At first, Rachel assumed it was just shyness, that Ava would warm up to Jason over time. But as the weeks passed, Ava's unease grew. She no longer wanted to play with her toys when Jason was around. She refused to be left alone with him. Jason, on the other hand, seemed irritated by Ava's presence. He didn't like how much attention Rachel gave her daughter. He would complain whenever Ava interrupted their time together, rolling his eyes when Rachel got up to comfort her. Sometimes, he would grab Ava's arm a little too roughly, forcing her to sit down when she tried to leave the room. Rachel told herself he was just being playful, that he didn't mean any harm. The first time Ava came to her crying, saying Jason had hurt her, Rachel hesitated. She wanted to believe her daughter, but she also wanted to believe Jason. He was her boyfriend, the only person who had been there for her in a long time. So she convinced herself that Ava was exaggerating, that she had misunderstood. Jason assured her it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. Rachel chose to believe him. Neighbors started to notice small bruises on Ava's arms and legs. A few people asked Rachel about them, but she always had an explanation. Ava was clumsy, always falling. She played too rough. She had delicate skin that bruised easily. The excuses came naturally, and after a while even Rachel believed them. But the truth was far more terrifying. Jason's frustration with Ava was growing, and the darkness inside him was beginning to surface. Rachel refused to see it, but others could. And soon, it would be impossible to ignore. Rachel's world slowly began to revolve around Jason. She was no longer just a mother working hard to provide for her child. She was a woman desperate to hold on to the love she thought she had found. Jason, with his unpredictable moods and short temper, had taken control of her life in ways she didn't even realize. He dictated who she could talk to, when she could go out, and how she should spend her time. What started as sweet attention soon became suffocating control. He despised Ava. The little girl with her bright eyes and soft giggles was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. He resented the way Rachel cared for her, how she would drop everything the moment Ava needed something. He hated the way Ava looked at him, cautious, unsure, and scared. And most of all, he hated the way Rachel defended her. Though Rachel refused to admit that Jason was cruel, she still protected Ava in small ways, stepping in when Jason's anger flared, making excuses to keep them apart. But it wasn't enough. The punishment started small, a harsh word when Ava spilled something, a tight grip on her wrist when she hesitated to obey. Then one day, Jason bit her. It was quick, so sudden that Ava didn't even have time to react before he pulled away and laughed. Rachel, shocked, demanded to know what he was doing. Jason shrugged it off, saying he was just playing, that kids needed to be tough, that Ava was too sensitive. Rachel let it go. She convinced herself that Jason meant no harm, that it wouldn't happen again. But it did. Over and over again. At first, it was just tiny nips on Ava's arms and hands, but soon the bites became deeper, crueler. Ava's small body bore the marks of Jason's rage. She stopped smiling. She flinched at sudden movements. She barely spoke. Rachel saw it. She knew something was deeply wrong, but she was trapped between the truth and the lies she told herself. To survive, people noticed. A neighbor mentioned the bruises, asking if everything was okay. A cashier at the grocery store stared at the deep purple marks on Ava's arm. And then, Rachel's co-worker at the diner pulled her aside and asked outright if someone was hurting Ava. The words hit like a slap, forcing Rachel to confront what she had been avoiding. But instead of accepting the truth, she panicked. That night, she told Jason what had happened, expecting him to be worried, maybe even scared. Instead, he was furious. He told her that people were trying to ruin their relationship, that they wanted to take Ava away just to punish her. He convinced Rachel that if anyone called Child Protective Services, they would take Ava and put her in foster care, and she would never see her daughter again. Rachel believed him. Out of fear, she quit her job and isolated herself completely. No more neighbors, no more co-workers, no more outsiders who could see what was happening. She thought she was protecting Ava, but in reality, she was making sure no one would be there to save her. The night was quiet, the air heavy with an unsettling stillness. Rachel needed to make a quick trip to the store, leaving Ava alone with Jason. She hesitated at the door, glancing at her daughter curled up on the couch. Ava was barely speaking these days, her once lively spirit dulled by constant fear. Rachel told herself she would only be gone for a few minutes. Jason had promised to behave. She wanted to believe him. She had to believe him. As soon as the door shut behind Rachel, Jason turned to Ava. His expression darkened, his irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. She was always there, always in the way. Tonight, he wasn't in the mood to deal with her. She sat quietly, eyes downcast, hoping he would ignore her, but that only made him angrier. When Ava accidentally knocked over his soda, Jason's patience snapped. He sprang from his seat, his face twisted in rage. Ava scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. He grabbed her arm, his grip crushingly tight, and she let out a tiny, terrified whimper. That sound, that pathetic little sound, enraged him even more. He bit her. Hard, harder than he ever had before. Ava screamed in pain, but Jason didn't stop. The sharp sting of his teeth sank into her skin over and over again. Her tiny body twisted in agony as she tried to break free, but he was too strong. The more she cried, the more violent he became. His nails dug into her arms, his hands shoving her down as he continued his vicious assault. Ava's screams grew, weaker, her little body unable to take the pain. Blood seeped from the deep marks on her skin. Her breaths became short, frantic gasps. Her limbs trembled, struggling to fight back, but the strength was slipping away from her. Jason didn't stop. His fury consumed him completely, his actions no longer in his control. By the time Rachel returned, the apartment was eerily silent. She stepped inside, her plastic grocery bags rustling in the stillness. The moment she saw Ava's lifeless body, on the floor, the air was ripped from her lungs. Her daughter's small frame was covered in bruises and bite marks, her once bright eyes staring blankly. Her scream was raw, piercing through the night. She dropped everything, collapsing beside Ava, shaking her, begging her to wake up. But there was no response. Jason stood nearby, his expression blank, as if he was merely observing the aftermath of something insignificant. Rachel's mind couldn't process what she was seeing. The child she had carried, the baby she had rocked to sleep, the little girl, who once held her hand so tightly, gone. The weight of her choices, the warnings she had ignored, crashed down on her all at once. Her world had shattered beyond repair, and there was no undoing what had been done. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of the small apartment as officers rushed inside. The 911 call had been frantic, Rachel's screams, incoherent sobs, and the chilling words that no parent should ever have to say, "My baby is dead." The first officer on the scene froze at the sight. Ava's tiny body lay on the living room floor, her delicate skin covered in dark bruises and deep bite marks. Blood had dried around the wounds, stark against the pale softness of her lifeless form. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the terror frozen in her face, her mouth slightly open as if her last breath had been stolen away too soon. Rachel was hysterical, rocking back and forth, clutching Ava's lifeless hand, refusing to let go. The paramedics tried to pull her away, but she fought them, screaming that Ava needed her, that this was all a mistake. Jason, however, stood completely still. His face was emotionless, his hands shoved into his pockets as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. His lack of reaction sent a chill through the offices. Detectives arrived within the hour, and the interrogation began immediately. Rachel was too distraught to answer at first. Between gasping sobs, she kept repeating that she should have stayed home, that she should have known something like this would happen. But the guilt and regret didn't change the facts. Her child was dead, and someone had to be held responsible. Jason sat in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, staring blankly at the floor. When the officers asked him what had happened, he shrugged. His voice was cold, devoid of any remorse. She wouldn't stop crying. That was all he said. The medical examiner confirmed what the officers already suspected. Ava had suffered prolonged abuse. Her body showed signs of old bruises, deep tissue damage, and healing bite wounds. This was not a single moment of rage. This was a pattern of torture that had escalated to a fatal breaking point. Rachel's role in Ava's death was unclear at first. Had she been another victim, manipulated by Jason into submission? Or had she willingly ignored the abuse happening right in front of her? The detectives dug into her past, speaking with neighbors, former co-workers, anyone who had seen her with Ava. The stories were the same. Rachel had been warned. People had noticed the bruises, the fear in Ava's eyes. the way Jason controlled every aspect of Rachel's life. But she had done nothing. That made her guilty too. The police arrested Jason for first-degree murder, but Rachel wasn't spared. She was taken into custody for child neglect and endangerment. She had chosen Jason over her daughter, ignored every warning, and now Ava was gone. As the officers led her out of the apartment, her screams filled the hallway, not just for her lost child, but for the horrifying truth she could no longer deny. She had let this happen. The courtroom was silent as the prosecutor displayed the autopsy photos on a large screen. Each image was worse than the last: dark bruises, bite marks, broken skin. Ava's small body had endured months of torment, and the evidence left no room for doubt. The jury members shifted uncomfortably, some unable to look at the gruesome images. The weight of what had happened to the 4-year-old was unbearable. Jason sat motionless at the defendant's table, his face blank as the prosecution detailed the horrors he had inflicted. He showed no emotion when they described how Ava's tiny body had been covered in wounds, how her last moments had been filled with pain and terror. He didn't flinch when they read out the forensic reports that confirmed the bites on her body matched his own dental impressions. Even as his own fate hung in the balance, he remained eerily detached. Rachel's trial ran separately, but her role in Ava's death was just as heavily scrutinized. The defense painted her as a victim, young, vulnerable, manipulated by a controlling and violent teenager. They argued that Jason had isolated her, making her fear losing both him and Ava if she sought help. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They played voicemail recordings from concerned friends who had warned her. They called in neighbors who had seen the bruises, who had noticed Ava shrinking away from Jason in fear. The final blow came when Ava's daycare provider took the stand. She spoke of how Ava had become quieter, more withdrawn, how she would flinch at sudden movements, how she once whispered, "Mommy doesn't listen when I say I'm scared." The words hung in the air, cutting through any argument that Rachel had been an innocent bystander. Jason was sentenced first. Despite his young age, the judge ruled that the brutality of his actions warranted the harshest punishment. He was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. His reaction was chilling. No tears, no anger, just a slow nod, as if he had already accepted his fate long before the trial began. When he was led out of the courtroom, he didn't look back. Rachel's sentence came next. While she hadn't physically hurt Ava, she had allowed it to happen. Her neglect had given Jason the power to destroy the one person she was supposed to protect. The judge handed down a 25-year sentence for child endangerment and manslaughter. As she was led away, her sobs filled the courtroom, but there was no sympathy left for her. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. The case faded from the headlines, but Ava's story never truly disappeared. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that ignoring the warning signs can have devastating consequences. The small town where she lived held a candlelight vigil every year on the anniversary of her death, a silent promise that her suffering would not be forgotten. But no matter how many people mourned her, one truth remained. Ava never got the chance to grow up, and nothing could ever change that.